I'm usually a single malt drinker, but today I'm going down the bourbon rabbit hole and trying a selection of bourbons from Rabbit Hole Distillery. Sorry, that was a dad joke. I can do better than that. Keep watching, the video will be better. Hey guys, I'm Doc Martin, the Whiskey Scribe. I'm a whiskey enthusiast and I love all things whiskey. But taste is subjective and there's a lot of whiskies out there. So whether you're a connoisseur or you just want to know more about whiskey, let's explore it together. If you'd like to see more from me, hit subscribe. I put up new videos every week. You can also follow me over on Instagram. Now, I've had my eye on Rabbit Hole Bourbon for quite some time, but it's not available here in Australia. So I want to say a big thank you to Doc Martinez for sending me these samples. Doc has a YouTube channel called Old Fashioned Ways, where he set himself the goal of trying 1,000 different variations of the whiskey-based cocktail, an old fashioned. It's always interesting to see how he comes up with a different take on this classic cocktail, and he also reviews single malts and bourbons. And that brings me to why I've been so interested in Rabbit Hole whiskey. Now, I mentioned last week that I definitely lean towards single malt, but I'm interested in trying and exploring more bourbons. The creator of Rabbit Hole whiskey is, and I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing this right, it's Cavehill. I'm sorry if I got that wrong. But he's a former clinical psychologist who considered himself a Scotch drinker until he met his wife Heather, and she introduced him to bourbon, and he refers to that as going down the rabbit hole. As a Scotch drinker, he was really interested in the history and tradition of bourbon, and he really just did go down the rabbit hole, just exploring as much as he possibly could, meeting experts in the industry, taking classes, and learning as much as he could about bourbon. Now, as much as he loved his new favorite spirit, he was getting really frustrated with how much sourced bourbon there was on the market. All with the same mash bill, so pretty much tasting the same. So he wanted to take a more modern approach to whiskey making, experimenting with different mash bills, still at least 51% corn, so it's classified as bourbon, but including malted barley and other grains to create things that are unique but distinct expressions of American whiskey. So each of the bourbons from Rabbit Hole has a different mash bill, and then they'll even age or finish some of these in different barrels to give something unique. Now, I'm not going to go too much further into the history of the distillery because I've been waiting years to try these and I'm finally here. Starting with the Heigold Kentucky Straight Bourbon Whiskey, which is a high rye double malt. Now, all Rabbit Hole barrels are toasted before charring. So that's where the barrel itself is heated over a wood fire, which is meant to bring some more of the sugars from the wood out to the surface to help infuse with the spirit as it's aging. They also advertise that they never chill filter, and they also never use more than 15 barrels per batch. So for a rather large commercial distillery like Rabbit Hole, that's pretty small batch. Now, the Heigold is made with a really high percentage of rye grains. We don't have the actual full mash bill, so I'm not sure of the percentages, but it's still called bourbon, so we're talking about a minimum 51% corn, with a really high proportion of German rye and some malted barley. It's aged for a minimum of 3 years before bottling at 47.5%. So after all these years of waiting, here I am. Now, there's a beautiful, I'd call it copper, but almost a red hue on this. It's a beautiful color. And on the nose, I'm actually getting a bit of malty sweetness on the nose. Something that I'd call almost dark fruits, I'd say. And there's something else there I can't quite put my finger on. So dark fruits, when you're talking about the nose of a whiskey, that's sort of things like blackberries and blueberries and cherries and stuff like that. I'm not sure what that other thing is that I'm getting on the nose, but I think if it carries across to the palate, I should be able to pick it out. Okay, I'm a little relieved because after all these years of waiting, there was a small part of me that was worried that I wouldn't like this, which would have been such a letdown. But that, just on the first sip, that was really nice. That's got a real buttery texture, and I'm still trying to pull the other parts out of it, but yeah, I'm getting a very strong flavor of butterscotch. There are some other really subtle fruits in there that I can't quite determine. But whatever was on that nose that I can't put my finger on is still, it's there on the palate and I still can't pick it out. I think I'm just having a mental blank. It's excitement, I'm nervous, it's the first date. I can actually taste a little bit of the It's sort of more on the finish. There's a char sort of element that comes from the fact that, you know, bourbon barrels are charred, but I'm really getting a strong, not strong, but it's just really lingering on the finish, that char element. But yeah, just the buttery texture of that is sensational. Well, okay, so if I refer to the notes from the distillery, they say that you're meant to get toasted malt and warm baking spices on the nose. And yeah, maybe it's baking spices that I was picking up. I did get a little bit of malt on the nose at first, and I was really hesitant to say it because I'm a single malt drinker experiencing bourbon for the first time, and I wasn't sure if I was just transposing what I expect from a whiskey onto the bourbon. But yeah, there's toasted malt there. I should have just had confidence in myself and said it. They state silky butterscotch on the palate. 100%. That butteriness, that's 100%, that's butterscotch. That was beautiful. And they say that there's hints of citrus and pepper on the finish. Okay, yeah, there's a little bit of pepper mixed in with that char that I mentioned on the finish. And then, yeah, I think I can sort of get a little bit of citrus. It still feels a little bit more like dark fruits to me, but I don't think I'm getting the citrus. One of the important things to remember when it comes to tasting notes, on whether they're written on the bottle, whether they're from somebody else, it's subjective. We've all got slightly different palates. You'll find a lot of the time the tasting notes will pretty reasonably accurately reflect what the whiskey tastes like. But if you don't taste something that's in the tasting notes, you're not wrong. If you taste something that's not in the tasting notes, that's also not wrong. Tasting notes. If you taste something that's also not in the tasting notes, that's not wrong either. Taste is subjective. We're all going to get a slightly different experience, and that's good. Next we have Cavehill Kentucky Straight Bourbon Whiskey, which is a 4-grain triple malt. So on this one we actually know the mash bill. So there's 70% corn, 10% malted wheat, 10% honey malted barley, and 10% malted barley, hence that triple malt. And it's bottled at 47.5%. So this one has a very similar color to the previous one. If you look at them side by side, they're almost identical colors. On the nose, I'm sort of getting some earthy spices, sort of a bit of a caramelized sweetness in there. Maybe caramelized isn't the right word. It's maybe a bit of a fresher sort of sweetness. Not sure. I will explore further. This just goes to show how little I know about American whiskey, because on my first sip there, I was about ready to say that tasted like rye. But I think what I'm actually getting is the wheat and probably the honey malted barley. Okay, so I think that caramelized sweetness that I was referring to, now that I've tasted it again, I think that's more of like a marmalade, sort of like an orange sweetness. Yeah, it's sort of, it's zesty like orange. It's a little bit thinner on the mouthfeel compared to the previous one. So that first whiskey, really strong butterscotch. It was creamy on the mouth. This to me is a little bit thinner. And then on the finish, I'm sort of getting, there's some sort of sweetness carrying across there. It's maybe a malted sweetness. It's sort of, I'm trying to think of the right words for it. It's almost like some sort of like powdery kind of sweetness. Maybe icing sugar with something else added. Yeah, actually, each time I sip that, I'm getting more and more orange. There's like that citrus flavor gets stronger as it goes, and now it's kind of lingering on the palate. To tell you the truth, this one isn't as much to my taste as the first one was. I'm glad I didn't taste this one first. I don't dislike it. It's still a nice whiskey. In fact, I believe this one is actually the entry-level whiskey. This was the first one they released. As an entry-level whiskey, it's nice, but it's probably not the one I would purchase and take home. Still interesting to have tried it, and I obviously don't hate it because I sipped again. Okay, so let's see what they say. So the tasting notes from the distillery state that you should get spice, honey, and fresh apples on the nose. I still wouldn't call that fresh apples, but yeah, the spice and I suppose the honey I'd agree with. Creamy flavors of orange, honey, mint, toasted grain on the palate. Mint, maybe. Maybe. Not really for me. I'm getting more of the orange than the mint. And then it says vanilla and custard on the finish. I am getting vanilla. I don't know if I'd call it custard, unless they make custard differently in America. But still, not bad, but I'm excited for the next one. Last but not least, we have the Dereringer Kentucky Straight Bourbon Whiskey, a double barrel PX sherry cask. Now there's two things I want to touch on here. Firstly is the spelling of the name, the Dereringer. It was really throwing me off. I actually had to look up a few different videos to find out how to actually say it. It's pronounced Dereringer. If somebody let me know if there's something going on with the spelling there, because the only thing I could find on the entirety of the internet that spelt Dereringer was anything referencing this whiskey. So yeah, I'm at a loss. I don't know. It's, as far as I know, the distiller, the one who made it, he called it Dereringer. That's what I'm going with. But the other thing I love about this is the PX sherry cask finish. Now PX stands for Pedro Jimenez, which is a form of Spanish sherry. And aging or finishing a whiskey in PX sherry casks is such a single malt whiskey thing to do. So you can really see where that Scotch influence for the distiller carries across into what he's doing with bourbon. But it's still a bourbon. So it's made from a mash bill of 65% corn, 25% wheat, and 10% malted barley, bottled at 46.5%, and then finished in that PX sherry cask. Now from that sherry cask, you can already see to look at this that it's got a darker sort of amber color to it. It's definitely taken a lot more color from the barrel than those other whiskeys that have been aged in virgin oak. And on the nose, straight away I am getting that beautiful sherry aroma that you get from a sherry single malt. I don't know if I picked this in a blind if I would have known that it's not single malt, but because I know it, I can tell that there's this underlying sweetness that sort of comes from the bourbon whiskey. I have to admit, with anything aged in sherry cask, I sometimes find it a little bit difficult to find anything other than the sherry aroma, but I think it's just because I love sherry bombs, and once I smell the sherry, that's all my brain is trying to find. So I'll have to go in on the palate. That's really lovely. I was concerned that something aged in sherry that was already kind of sweet might be a little bit too sweet, but it's actually really well balanced. I dare say they have to be really, really careful with how long they leave the bourbon in the sherry casks, but they've hit just the right amount of time that you've got this beautiful balance of sweetness that almost comes across as, it's almost like a really well done candy or creme brulee. I would say this has got a really strong flavor of creme brulee, like when it's done perfectly well. The finish is kind of, it's quite similar to Scottish whiskies when they've been aged in sherry cask. You've got this little bit of a dry finish. There's a bit of a toasted sort of malt in there as well. That's fantastic. I really like that. So if we look at the tasty notes from the distillery, it's meant to have sherry, I got that, caramel and cherry on the nose, then raisins, currants, cherries, almonds, and vanilla on the palate. Now naturally I get the raisins from the sherry. Yeah, looking for it, I can get a little bit of the almonds and the vanilla. I'm not the biggest fan of cherries, so I may not be finding that just because it's not what I'm looking for, but that's pretty accurate for the palate. And then their tasting notes say that there's a dry finish. So yeah, usually with a single malt whiskey, if it's been aged in for a significant time in sherry casks, you will get a little bit of a dry finish. It's quite a nice texture almost at the end. And it's interesting that for both single malt and bourbon, that still has that same effect. I wasn't sure if it'd be a little bit different because you've got those sweeter sort of compounds in the corn-based whiskey, but it definitely carried across. But as far as a single malt whiskey approach to a bourbon, that is really well done, and that is exactly the sort of thing that I was excited to try when I first read about Rabbit Hole Distillery. Now, it was great to finally be able to try these whiskeys. So thanks again to Doc Martinez from Old Fashioned Ways. Seriously, check out his channel. It's way too hot here in Australia during summer to drink whiskey neat, and that's when I always turn back into old fashions. And that channel is a great resource if you're looking for different ways to experiment with that cocktail. But I also wanted to mention how I found out about this distillery, because believe it or not, I wasn't just sitting there one night Googling distilleries that resonate with my life. Now, I do enjoy the occasional cigar, and one of the brands that I like is Diesel, which has a range of cigars called Whiskey Row, which is a collaboration line with Rabbit Hole Distillery. So they actually use bourbon barrels from Rabbit Hole, and they age the cigar wrapper leaf in those barrels to help sort of infuse some of the bourbon flavors into the cigar leaf. Now, I really enjoyed those cigars, and unfortunately I enjoyed them too much. I finished them all, so I don't have any left that I could try and pair with this whiskey, but I'm still just stoked that after all these years, I finally managed to get to try it. So thanks again, Doc, and Rabbit Hole, come on, what are you doing? Let's get into Australia. We would love to have this here. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like. It really does help me out. If you want to see more from me, hit subscribe. And until next time, enjoy what's in your glass, no matter where it's from, and sláinte. Yeah, that first one is almost tied favourite with the last one.
Tastes like cake. That's gonna be a favourite.
Who doesn't like cake?